Well, welcome. We are very excited that you have joined us today for this webinar, very exciting webinar with these two distinguished gentlemen, Hispanic Theological Heritage, a conversation with Dr. Luigi Peñaranda and Dr. Abson Joseph. Today's event is part of the Wesley Seminary Webinar Series with the goal of resourcing the local church, including our alumni, our current student, and others. Should you have any questions during today's presentation, please submit those at the Q&A forum at the bottom of the screen. Dr. Joseph will monitor those and they will answer those questions as time allows after their conversation today. Now, Dr. Luigi Peñaranda is Associate Professor of Global Leadership and Latina Christian Studies, and he also serves as the Director of Graduate Theological Programs in Spanish at Wesley Seminary. Dr. Abson Joseph is Vice President of Academic Affairs and Professor of New Testament. Greetings, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us today. As I said, we're very excited about this conversation, and we're excited to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. So thank you so much for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Joel. Greetings to all of you. Welcome, and thank you, Dr. Peñaranda, for being available to have this conversation with us today.
What a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. So if you allow me to start right off the bat, we're celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month. So I think the first question then is, why do we celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. And I'm going to be very candid in this conversation. But the reality is, when we ask that question, like, why do we celebrate? I have to start with a story. There was a time in which I did not celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. And of course, there's a background for that. I'm originally from Colombia, Bogotá, Colombia. For those who don't know, my full name is Luis Guillermo Peñaranda Leal Supelano Sanchez Ortega Jimenez. I'm an immigrant, now a U.S. citizen. But even as a Latino Hispanic immigrant, when I came to the United States and people ask about how do you celebrate Hispanic heritage, I made the connection with the language, Hispanic heritage. I understand that, but didn't know anything about the celebration. And to be honest with you, for a while, it was in the back of my knowledge, but I didn't really celebrate it with an awareness and a conscious of its meaning. And this may sound kind of funny, but when I joined Indiana Wesleyan University, I was asked in the beginning to participate in so many Hispanic heritage celebrations. And I was a guest speaker. And at some point I asked myself, like, I gotta figure out what this is all about, to be a little more honest in representing the real voice. So Hispanic heritage it became something that I started going after. What is this Hispanic heritage and how do we celebrate it? And of course, most people know, at least the basic, that it is a month of celebration for the contributions of Hispanics to the United States. I was shocked to learn that the celebration in itself started in the 1960s. So we're talking about a very recent celebration that started with Lyndon Johnson. And we have to think about the 60s in the United States and civil rights movements and tensions with the war. And it is at this time that he selected the celebration of Hispanic heritage. In the beginning, it was 1 week, and it is with Ronald Reagan who actually institutes this full month of celebration of Hispanic heritage. And it's not a month exactly, so it is from September 15th to October 15th. It is a month, but it doesn't fit within a particular month. And it is because during that time, there are many of the independence days of countries in Latin America took place. So it's celebrated that way. And after I started realizing, oh my goodness, this even though it's a recent celebration, it's a celebration of heritage. It is not until I came to the United States and started going to church with so many other Hispanics with different backgrounds, different stories, different upbringings, different socializations, but very common experiences in the United States, that I began to understand the profound significance of celebrating. So you ask about Hispanic Heritage Celebration. I need to pause on celebration because there are so many different ways of celebrating. This is a funny story too, but I remember one time living in Los Angeles, someone came up to me and said, happy Cinco de Mayo, happy Independence Day. Do you want to come and celebrate with us? We're going to go to a Mexican restaurant. And I had to pause for a second. I was moved by the invitation to go celebrate. But first, happy Independence Day. And then I had that little cognitive dissonance. Like, wait a second, I'm Colombian, not Mexican, even though if I had to choose, apart from my own nationality, if I had to choose another nationality, I would become Mexican any day, love Mexico, and that would be my choice. But this person, out of ignorance, obviously said, hey, happy Cinco de Mayo, happy Independence Day. And one, I am not from Mexico, and two, Cinco de Mayo is not the Mexican independence. And I'm so glad that you're going to celebrate. But what I had to learn about Hispanic heritage is I got to be careful what celebration I'm doing. It's not just, oh, let's just go eat, but it's really meditating and going deeper into the understanding of what is this heritage that we receive. And this is not just about immigrants. This is about a deeper, richer legacy that started, and perhaps started, I want to talk about this, started before there was ever a country named the United States of America. The contributions of the heritage of Hispanics began even before we can talk about this political way of organizing. So even myself, as a Latino, as someone that's aware of Hispanic issues, as someone that's wrestled with church and faith of Latinos in the United States, I've been on a journey of learning what is this heritage, what have we received, and even more, what are we gonna leave behind in this journey? So I'm learning, and I'd love to share with you some of the things that I've learned.
No, I mean, this is fascinating. Thanks for looking at both the meaning and then also the different ways that we celebrate. As we were talking about putting this together, you wanted to focus on specifically Hispanic theological heritage, right? Not just Hispanic heritage in general, but the theological piece in particular. How can we understand and embrace, in celebration, the theological heritage of Hispanic in the United States?
Yeah, I titled it Hispanic Theological Heritage. But it was intentional with the whole idea of saying that there is no way of looking at the theological side of the heritage without looking at the Hispanic contributions. It's often we try to think of this modern world as a separation between church and state, and we try to see sometimes faith as this a confined element that is private, that is about beliefs, and that doesn't overlap with the everyday life of individuals. And the reality is that A, that is not necessarily true. You cannot disassociate those realities. And B, it is definitely not true about Hispanic. If you're going to talk about Hispanic heritage, there's no way to disassociate it from faith and from belief. And part of that has to do with to be able to talk about Hispanics and these common experiences different background, different origins, same language, same cultural influences, but very many different stories that are converging in this territory. You have to begin with faith, and we have to revisit this story. I think one of the things that is important is that the story of Hispanics is not just a pretty story. It is kind of like the biblical narrative that they tell you the good, the bad, and the ugly, and you got to learn how to deal with that. And when we talk about theological heritage, we got to go to the origins and begin to see that Hispanics have been leaving roots and foundations ever since the times of colonial Spanish conquista. It is important. Sometimes when we talk about Hispanic heritage, even though the celebration is so recent, we forget historically that Spain conquered territories. Even today, when people talk about going to Florida and going to San Agustin, St. Augustine, or they want to talk about going to Texas, San Antonio, or San Diego, we forget that this is heritage that came from colonial times, and the vision of these colonial times really began with this mix between the interest of colonizing and evangelizing. And here the story gets tense because it was a combination, something not easy to disassociate, to see only the colonial side of things without the faith, because they went hand in hand. One of the things that the Spaniards did and did really well is everywhere they settle, they began to establish settlements, and they would have soldiers, but they would also establish pueblos, towns, and missions. And even today, anyone can go and do a tour. I recently moved to San Antonio, and you can go visit the missions. And it is almost an archaeological residue of something that happened during that colonial time. And this effort to, in a sense, proclaim the message of Christianity mixed with a lot of other ideological thinking. And one of the early roots that we have from this Hispanic heritage is that we see the influence that they live in territories that today are considered the United States, but at some point where Virreinato de Nueva España, by royalty of New Spain, eventually became Mexican territories, and today we talk about them as U.S. territories. But the legacy, if we do a sociological archaeology, we begin to see not only missions and buildings, but we begin to see realities that were happening even from the early beginnings. One of those realities that I want to talk a little about that is mestizaje. One of the things that are distinctive about Hispanics in general is that even very early on with the conquest and the colonization, there was a mixture of today we would say races, but there was a mixture in which these identities were really embraced. There was all the desecration of the indigenous land and beliefs, but there was also a syncretism, and there was also a mixing. And Hispanics in general embrace these multiple identities in which we are not just allies of one side of the other one. We're the product of these encounters, some of them very violent, and a complete desecration of lands, peoples, and beliefs, but also a mixing of those in which many Hispanics today embrace that reality of mestizaje, of the mixing. And we can't forget that the Spaniards also brought an influence. They were conquered by Muslims, and there's a mixing of culture that even arrived to this new world in which they were trying to bring a theological vision of conversion to Christianity, but the cultural mixing was there. Many people were fleeing. They were called the New Christians, and to flee some of the Inquisition and the persecutions, they were dispersed and became the New Christians in a way of surviving, but their culture and their influence was already a mixture of cultures. And I think to begin to understand the depth of this celebration, we need to really understand the depth of this mixing and the depth of all this cross-pollination of cultural influences that converge in this identity, that we are not homogeneous. We're so diverse and so different, yet there are some experiences, multi-identities that accompany our deep roots of who we are. So that's just a little opening, Abson, to begin to explore perhaps the beginnings of this colonial theological heritage, and maybe we need to make our way into today and these realities.
I mean, no, that's very good, and I think that's been helpful in terms of kind of tracing that. And what I'm hearing you say is that you cannot really disassociate that theological piece because it was there from the very beginning, and paying attention to that matters. And in the context of our work as Wesley Seminary, training pastors who understand that so that they can also understand how to help their congregations do that. And I'm intentional by saying training pastors, both our students who study in the English language program and students who study in the Spanish language program, understanding what that is. So then maybe I wonder, in talking about the theological piece and who we are as Wesley Seminary, can you then spend some time kind of fleshing out what are we doing at Wesley Seminary to honor Hispanic heritage? And in your opinion, what do we still need to learn, not only to celebrate the Hispanic heritage, but to contribute to the theological legacy of Hispanic? So we can break this down into two if you want, so that just for clarity. So we can focus on that first piece in terms of what are we doing, and then we can then talk about the learning piece. Yeah,
and if you will, let me get to that.
Okay.
But maybe doing a little longer historical recounting of certain aspects, because I think it is important. Obviously, we want to talk about what's going on today, what's going on with Hispanics in the United States. What are the realities that they are facing, and what are the theological challenges? Often among many colleagues, I hear them speaking about we live in a post-Christian society. And I understand what they are saying in terms of the reality that's being lived in the United States. But also there's a side of me that says, have you been to a Latino church lately in the United States? Because there's some things that are happening in Christianity that perhaps when we limit and we talk about society without looking at a broader spectrum, we may miss that God is really up to some things. But before I get to that, I really need to go back a little to the recounting of the history. Because in the early struggles of proclaiming the Christian faith, we have to deal with this reality of colonization. And it is really interesting because the first reflections on theological thinking about the reality of indigenous in the New World really came out of wrestling with this idea of a sort of evangelization by force and by violence. It is this idea that the conquistadores arrive and they were to convert all the people that they encounter with a theology that said the reality is these people have no souls. And even the Pope signed a bulla, I don't know how you say that in English, but the conquistadors were authorized to dispossess the people with this theological thinking that they're just animals. They don't have souls. So whatever you can take it, and your job is civilize them and teach them the Christian religion. Of course, we start with a twisted message of what Christianity is all about, but this is part of that story because perhaps the theological heritage that Hispanics bring is a way of trying to untangle a messy message, an idea of what the gospel is. So early on, we have individuals like Bartolomé de las Casas that based on Montesinos, and I recommend there's a beautiful book, and I think Robert Chao Romero wrote a book called The Brown Church. I've read it several times, and he does a beautiful job at explaining and recounting the history of Latinos, Chicanos from early on. But he highlights how Bartolomé de las Casas inspired in Montesinos' sermon begins to argue and present this idea. Hey, wait a second. These are human beings that need the grace and need the gospel. And there's an initial theological questioning that has to do with what is the gospel? What is the message? What is it that Jesus really called us to do? And coming to an awareness that many times we've been socialized into Christian messages that are more the imposition of our cultural values than really proclaiming the gospel. And early on, we have the first questioning, if you will, a theological questioning of a colonial approach of doing evangelization, of doing education. And today, this is really important because even now, in 2021, the real hot topics about Hispanic theology have to do with decolonizing our mindsets, decolonizing the way we structure our way of living, and really evaluating the way in which our cultures have trumped the message of the cross and the resurrection, and have shaped it to be in the image of our cultural interests more than really elevating the dignity of the others. So in a sense, you have to deal with this duality of a colonial Christianity, but also with the beginning of the questioning, how do we decolonize? How do we argue against? How do we humanize? And how do we begin to transform truly the world with the message of Christ? So I think this is important to understand it. And I think it is important to some people, because of a political moment in which we live in the United States, think that this Hispanic heritage is just some condescending, oh yeah, we'll let them celebrate something, but lose sight that this heritage is rooted, that before there was a United States, there were territories that in many ways there are Hispanics in the United States that were here before there was ever a United States. And then many of the issues that we have with powers and migration are central to understand some of the issues that we face today with faith.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm if you allow us to linger here a little bit. So, I'm from Haiti, but the same process of colonization in terms of Columbus coming and late 1400s and early on in middle school, we had to study about Bartolomé de las Casas in terms of his work of protecting the native Americans and all of these different things. And I'm glad you talk about that. But as you talk about decolonizing, I think one thing that perhaps, if you want to say a little bit more about, is the liberation theology, and how that process, again, being from Haiti, there's kind of some alignment there in terms of, I have seen ways in which that process of embodying liberation theology can have both good and not so good parts in it. So as we talk about, Hispanic theological heritage, what are the ways in which we can approach liberation theology in a way that is forming and transforming in that process of decolonizing, again, not just systems, but our way of life, our structures and social constructs and theological framework?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a subject that would take an entire course at Wesley Seminary to talk a little about liberation theology in a way that is not just like, oh yeah, let's celebrate. People want to celebrate, like, well, let's go eat Mexican food, and they think that celebration. People talk about liberation theology often like that. Oh yeah, liberation theology, or they're suspicious about it. But you gotta enter into some realities of what people experience before you can really make judgments about the way it's being thought out. So experiences are very important. I hope you understand what I'm saying with the there's a way of celebrating that is not embodying the real phenomenon of what's happening. Let me clarify that a little too. I don't want to overextend myself, but one time I got invited by a close friend of mine to an Indian wedding, and I asked, when is this wedding? Hoping that they would give me a date so that I could just show up and celebrate, and they gave me 7 dates. In other words, I had to celebrate for the entire week this wedding, and it was a learning experience that before I could celebrate what I thought was a celebration of a wedding in my own imagination of a day I go drop off a gift and I leave, I had to enter into a rhythm of what it is celebration for this community and really embody that. So part of the things that is difficult to convey, Abson, is that because of this mestizaje, deep ingrained in the identities of Latinos all over the colonized world was this mixture of, they are a mixture of the people of the land, but they are also socialized in this Christian colonial way of thinking. And once you have this melting of identities, one of the things is that you have to realize that for Latinos, Catholicism was part of their identity. Even if they became Protestants later on, when the Protestants showed up, I think this is kind of interesting, and we miss the point that when Protestantism gets to Latin American countries, they discover that Christ has been preached there for 300 years. In other words, that the gospel somehow has been there. And here's something interesting, because a lot of the Protestant gospel was really a countercultural anti-Catholic movement. And here I have to stop real quick, because even though we are a Protestant seminary and I'm a Protestant believer and I became an evangelical Christian, as I study and analyze, the reality is even a lot of what I learned was Protestantism was just as colonizing culturally as it was when the Spanish conquistadors came. And so it was a way of becoming anti-Catholic more than truly Christian, if you understand what I'm saying. So even in this encounter, and at times very violent, in Hispanic worlds between Protestantism and Catholicism. And by the way, you can't separate any of that in terms of politics either. So if you wanted to be able to do affairs, political affairs, you have to be a strong Catholic. And there's a whole heritage in which Christ has been in the middle, but he also got caught in between some cultural fights and struggles. And to this day, we live this tension of Protestant Christians, Catholic Christians, a little bit of antagonism. I think what is interesting, Abson, is we're talking about Hispanics in the United States now and leaving a legacy and enjoying this heritage is when you come to the United States, whether you've been here since before there was a country called the United States, or whether you like me come as an immigrant, there's a shift that happens in which now here in the United States, we have a lot of commonalities. In my own experience, my church experience, I begin to see that I have a whole lot more in common. When I lived in Colombia, I didn't have a whole lot of things in common, at least in my mind. There were rivalries with other Latino countries because of soccer rivalries, and that translates into political, and it translates into prejudice. It translates into divisions. Some countries think they're better than other countries. We have classes, we have classism, we have all these problems. But all of those, in a sense, when you come to a place where you're a minority and some other social realities appear, some of these differences kind of melt away, and it creates another sense of identity. It's like you may be from another country, you may be Catholic, I may be Protestant, you may be have these experiences, but those kind of melt into, but we have common experiences here. The other thing that was happening in Latin America is to get to the liberation theology, is that even though Latin America experienced independence, and all our countries have stories of independence from Spain, they also experience neo-colonialism and have experienced this codependency, economic codependencies, and I mean, is that a reality in which we live? We live in a country that has debt, and our entire continent lives in these struggles. And one of the things that is a problem is the misery in which our societies have lived. And here's where theology becomes important. Theology cannot be done from just the office of theologians or from the classrooms of seminaries. Theology happens when you encounter those elements of struggle, suffering, poverty, misery, and you have to ask the question, in these nations with such religious heritage, where is Christ in the middle? What is Christ doing? Like, where is Christ in the middle? This Christ has been proclaimed since the colonial times. And here's the struggle where I think liberation theology, and there's no one single liberation theology. We have to talk about liberation theologies. But the center of this is some of the struggles of poverty and misery that we face in many countries. And I think it's a theology that is born out of how do we make sense of this reality, and a rereading of Christ, rereading of Christ in which, as you would know, there's been a great debate among scholars about the historical Jesus. Well, I think this is important because the liberation theology is a real dealing with the historical Jesus, who is this word made flesh that chooses to start his ministry in Galilee, not in Judea, not in the center of
power.
Theological Judaism, right? Who is this that even though he's proclaiming a kingdom that hopefully will overthrow any other kingdom, especially the Romans, who is this king that begins a ministry among the marginalized? Who is this king that he's doing miracles, but not just any miracles? He's going to the untouchables and he's touching them, and he's restoring their capacity to re-engage the worshiping community of Israel. Who is this Messiah preacher who we have the record of his words, even though he never wrote anything, and we have his words in a language that probably was not his first language. Who is this Jesus that probably spoke with an accent when he attempted to speak some Greek? And we have these realities of who is this Jesus. And there's a lot of thinking then about the Jesus that seems to go after the marginalized, and that is not just proclaiming heaven when you die, which has been the consolation of a lot of our Latin America and Hispanic theology. Just the consolation that it's going to be hard here, but once you get to heaven, it's going to be all right. Who is this Jesus that's saying, no, 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 you need to pray the kingdom of God come here on earth as it is in heaven? And of course, you got to understand that both in the United States and in Latin America, in the 60s, we're living with certain realities that force our theology to rethink and to reapproach who this Jesus is and what is he all about when he says the kingdom is here. When you pray that the kingdom that his will would be done on earth as it is in heaven. And that is the beginning of many struggles. Liberation theology, which of course there are many readings with socio-economic consequences. I must say that there was also a more evangelically broad Protestant movement called Misión Integral. Misión Integral is this idea that you can't just preach the gospel to the hungry without feeding them. You can't just talk about justice when you go to heaven without doing justice on earth. And it is this, Misión Integral means holistic mission. Mm-hmm. Even before there was the language of missional church, which we have courses about that in the seminary, there was a language of misión integral. René Padilla, Samuel Escobar, Bonino, theologians who were wrestling even with these realities. And that was happening in Latin America, but simultaneously in the United States, there is a Hispanic theological reflection that deals with more worlds than one. It deals with the realities of all Latin America, but it also deals with new realities of the United States and the relationship that's taking place with Latinos in the United States.
No, that's very, very helpful. So in that sense, then, I don't know, since we're here lingering a little bit before we go into what Wesley Seminary is doing, do you then, both in the context of the Misión Integral and liberation theology, how do you think Latinas today in the United States, how do you feel that history, that theological heritage, how has it contributed, or how should he contribute in shaping both the way we view the world, the way so that celebration is something that's embodied? How do you invite the wider world to celebrate properly and enter and embody that world, that understanding?
Yeah, I think one of those important moments of reflection, of theological reflection, is when you begin to analyze the reality where you find yourself and the theology that you profess, and you begin to peel off perhaps a lot of cultural layers, a lot of things, and really wrestle with this idea of God, what are you doing? And wrestling with the reading of the Bible. What does it mean to read the Bible as a Hispanic in this moment in the United States, in a moment where there's a lot of social change and social tension, and begin to navigate, as I've said several times in my presentation, some of the roots of Hispanic heritage means that even before there was a nation here, there was a presence. Yet often when we talk about Hispanics, we have this kind of mindset to think about just immigrants, only immigrants. And if you use the language of immigrants, then there's a social connotation of illegal immigrants. And part of our duty, theological duty, is to begin to dismantle arguments that are confusing things and that don't let us see what God is really doing. But by the way, this is a problem because the reality is, I was just reading the census, The U.S. Hispanic population reached 62 million people in 2020 here in the United States, and 4 out of 5 Hispanics are citizens of the United States. So you got to dispel some of this language. But the reality is many of the Hispanics that read the Bible in the social, cultural context of the United States begin to read the text very much, I imagined, in ways in which sometimes Israel would read the scriptures and see, in a sense, the Lord promised some things. He promised blessing, but why do we find ourselves displaced in exile? Why do we encounter this social political realities? And I think today the question is, we're reading these realities, and you're reading the text, and you're beginning to ask the question, what is God doing? What is God really doing? I see the news and I see the mistreatment of immigrants, and then you can't help but read the scriptures where it says, "A God is a God of immigrants. He protects the widows. He protects the orphans." Like, make no mistake, oh Israel, like when it comes down to protecting the vulnerable, I am the God of the vulnerable. And it puts us in a place, Abson, where even as you look at the faces of the immigrants, I can't judge or make a judgment in general, but I do know that because of the Hispanic heritage, they are praying to God that He would make a way for them to find a hope and a future. Mm-hmm. And I think the answer is not saying when you die and go to heaven, then you will find hope. And I also don't think that the hope is saying, yeah, it is the American dream, because for many of them, they do discover that is something that becomes a little bit of a nightmare for them. Mm-hmm. So I think part of the embracing the celebration is an invitation to enter into the whole history of a struggle. It is very easy to dismiss certain theological thinking when you've not been part of the struggle. And part of a celebration is kind of like me going to the 7 days of celebration. Part of the opportunity of having this month is not just to go eat Latino food, but to actually enter into some narratives, to enter into the larger reality of what the church is living. And we have to challenge so many things. Some pastors are really happy that Latinos are renting their churches to have church, and they feel like, oh, we're doing the will of the Lord by letting them rent the buildings. And sometimes it's good intentions, but at times our cultural blindfolds don't let us see that, yes, you are collecting rent, but no, you are not advancing the kingdom of God. You're not relating with these congregations. They pay rent, but you're not entering into some struggles that the church is called to struggle. If this Jesus is making that journey from Galilee, and he's really dethroning any other power that races against the knowledge of Jesus Christ. So I think in the story of Hispanics, we are an invitation to enter into other level of struggles. Many communities have them, but a struggle in which clearly Jesus has been a central character, even if our cultural blindfolds have gotten in the mix.
So if I'm hearing you well, it's an invitation to journey beyond the month, beyond the time that's set, so that we do life together in ways that then allow us to identify both of the struggle, so that we know how to linger and show empathy and live well together.
Absolutely. I think one of my favorite stories in the Bible, there's many, but one of the things that I love about celebrations, if you will, in the Bible is that they're not just like, sometimes we have these ways of celebrating that are kind of superficial. Let me give you an example. Sometimes we do, hey, we want to invite you to celebrate with us, I don't know, a birthday, come to our house, and you do this 6 to 8 party, you clean up the house, you have great food, you have all these people that are going to come to your house, they come in and they say, how beautiful your house, we came to celebrate, and you have this 6 to 8 perfect scenario in which you walk away and you say, did you see their house? Beautiful house. Did you see their family? Beautiful family. Did you see? The reality is that's a level of celebration, of event-driven celebration. If you've ever been to a celebration with Latinos, don't ever ask, when does the party end? Because there's no time to end. And if you ask, when does the party start? They may say 6 o'clock, but if you show up at 8, it's okay. And this is actually an invitation to enter into a different kind of party, a party that doesn't have an end. And if you go to those parties, soon enough, you'll discover that after 2 hours, the beautiful families and the beautiful thing kind of runs out, and you begin to see, they're kind of dysfunctional like everybody else. Whoa, it's not perfect party anymore. It's beginning to deal with other realities. But you will never forget how much fun you've had in this unending celebration.
Mm-hmm.
I use that as an illustration because sometimes we look at the theology of liberation, or we want to approach communities, but we approach them as a 6 to 8 party. And all we want to look at is the perfect playhouse moments. But one of the beautiful things is when you begin to enter into a different type of celebration. I'll go back to my other illustration. I love in the Bible how, for instance, before there was a liberation in Exodus, God instituted a celebration, Pesach, Passover, right? And they had to, in a sense, enact an act of something that was about to happen. Because today they were slaves, but tomorrow they were free by the hand of the Lord. And there was a celebration that has enacting elements. And even today, participating in a Passover celebration is not just eating, the eating is part of it, but it's a reenactment, so much so that even the children participate in a reenactment of the struggle of what this celebration is. One of the things that I've had to learn as a Latino is I've had to myself just remove my blindfold of I'm just a Colombian Latino, or I came from this background. And because of the common experiences with Hispanics from different places, begin to enter into a different celebration where the enactment is part of who we are, where I need to not only cognitive, but I need to experience and understand the suffering, the reality of the enactment of what's happening with migrants, what is happening with indigenous communities, what is happening in the misery of the world. And as you begin to enter into this enactment, it is celebration, but it is a messy celebration, because all of a sudden you find that your story is so connected to a larger story that, messy as it is, it continues to be the story that Jesus wants to enter in and do something amazing. And I have to say, Abson, again, I talk a little about this post-Christian reality. That is one level that the church is experiencing. But if you open the eyes and celebrate what is going on in a Hispanic heritage, you would discover that, hey, there's something going on in the camp across the street, where Jesus seems to be showing up to their churches, and there's something that's going on in these communities, and I really believe that the Lord is moving and is bringing us to new places, new realities, because His church is alive and well, even in a messy, obscure, messed up world and social reality.
Oh, that's beautiful. Just as a reminder, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A forum. So Luigi, if you allow me to kind of bring this back then to Wesley Seminary, what are we doing to honor Hispanic heritage, Hispanic theological heritage. And in your opinion, what are the things that we still need to learn, not just to celebrate, but also to contribute to that theological legacy of Hispanic? And feel free to talk about both the opportunities and challenges we face as we wrap up.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we're doing, we're a seminary. We believe in education. We think this is central, and we educate pastors and ministers. On the one hand, we really have given thought to what prevents people from having access to education. And when we ask those questions, you have to enter into the messiness of what are the social conditions that inhibit access. And there are many, including financial, education in general is expensive. I have to, sorry, I derailed these things. By the way, there's a false assumption that there is not great education among Hispanics. So sometimes we have these colonial ways, oh, we need to give these Hispanics education. And it doesn't really work like that. Before there was ever a country called the United States, there were universities in Latin America where many disciplines were being taught and publications were being given. So I need to break some stereotype. But this is important because part of what we're trying to do is we got to be very careful that we don't have this kind of savior complex. Oh, we're giving education to Latinos. No, we are creating opportunities for cross-pollination and engagement with broader voices of the Latino community. We are becoming facilitators of these dialogues, but in many cases, they come with very vast, wide, diverse education, and they are the ones that are enriching the process. So while we want to be an instrument of opening doors and opportunities, we don't want to fool ourselves thinking that we are the solution. We know and are convinced that they are the solution and that they are bringing to the table this conversation. But one of the things that we're trying to do is change the way we create opportunity, financial accessibility to resources and educations, to remove this idea that education is for the privileged ones, and to change the way we're doing things. It is not perfect. It is certainly messy, but we are at least daring to enter into some of this messiness that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, but it certainly makes Jesus happy, I think. So that's one of the things that we're doing, but also learning. This is not easy, it's not messy, it's not Wesley Seminary doing it for them, it's them enriching Wesley Seminary and enriching us with a heritage that is more expansive than we even imagine. So that's one thing.
No, that's very good. Thank you so much. Muchísimas gracias. We have one question, if you allow me to ask a question from one of our participants. What can we do to educate our Christian community about Hispanic theological heritage?
Yeah. I think it's several things. I think we got to come to the party. We got to come to the celebration. So the first one is very simple. If someone is moving from a place of like, yeah, I know about Hispanic heritage celebration, but I don't do anything more. It's kind of like, sometimes we twist our holidays and make them into, oh yeah, this is the hot dog holiday. And there's nothing wrong with the hot dogs. That's part of the elements of celebration. But sometimes you got to go a step farther. You got to enter into the messiness. You got to stay longer than 6 to 8 to the party. So for many people, it really means putting themselves in a situation where you really are engaging the realities of the Hispanic community where you are. And I would have to say it is very difficult to escape the presence of the reality of Hispanic community in your communities. And even if it's not Hispanic, it is our duty to enter into the parties of anyone else that is there. It is what Jesus did with Levi. He calls him and he says, you're going to leave the booth. First thing we're going to do is we're going to party with your friends. And I think we're not doing a lot of partying. Of course, COVID puts some limits in it. But I do think that this is a time to get a little closer. Before we study the theology through the books, I think you gotta go to church. You gotta go sing. You gotta be uncomfortable. You gotta learn to sing in a language that is not your language, and worship even without understanding, so that you can have the understanding to experience their worship. I think it is a time to really understand that there are real needs in the communities, and sometimes we're aware of some of them. But it is hard to enter into the messiness. But this is celebration and messiness at the same time. So I think part of it is becoming humble. Another thing that we're trying to do, this one was very difficult for me. In my journey, I have to confess, one of the biggest sins in which I've been socialized in is classism. I was socialized into a system of classes and pretending, well, you go to this school because it's more important than this one. You wear these clothes because they somehow give you, and the biggest sin, and is no different than racism, is the same demon, just wear different clothes maybe. But one of the things that I had to learn is to allow myself to be decolonized, to enter into the struggle and really enter into communities. I had to set the jokes aside and I had to begin to embrace. I was like Moses a little bit when I came to the United States. I don't know if you remember Moses. He thought he was very Egyptian, and he tries to do justice with the Hebrews, but then he gets caught. Who the heck are you? Are you really gonna pretend that you are the just person? I had one of those moments too, where sometimes as Hispanics, we don't enter ourselves into the messiness. We think that somehow we're better because our country, our experiences, our things, and we bring an attitude in which, like Moses, we end up actually fleeing and having a crisis. And then Moses has such a deep crisis that he becomes a foreigner. He names his son, I'm a foreigner, that's his name. And he begins to have an experience of alienation. And once he gets the idea of being part of a community of the alienated ones, then he can become the liberator. Not before that. And part of the process is this. The white church will not save the brown church until the white church and the brown church get to be in the messiness together. And then we'll discover that we're here to save each other. And if I may say, the brown church may be here to bring salvation to a lot of our colonialized Christianity that we experience in these days.
So just if you've answered several questions that some of the participants have asked, but allow me, I know our time is almost up, just to say a little bit about what does leaning into messiness look like? You've begun to address that, but what kind of posture will allow that for us to be able to face the other and lean into that messiness in a productive way?
Yeah, it is both simple and complex, but I do think we have a tendency to intentionally not see the others, not see their faces, not see their struggles. I don't know if you've done this. I'm gonna confess all my sins, but sometimes when I like big cities, when you drive in big cities and you will encounter someone that's begging for money or for food in a stoplight. I don't know if you've ever felt like, oh, I hope it's a green light. And you're kind of praying, oh, Jesus, I hope that there's a green light so that I don't have to stop in the red light and have to stare at someone that leans over the glass and is looking at you eye to eye. And sometimes you start talking and making no eye contact. And in a sense, if we're not aware that we don't want to look, we have a real deep spiritual problem. It's not difficult. It is more reckoning with the awareness of like, why is it that I don't want to look at this person in the eyes? Why is it that I pray for a green light and not pray for these eyes and not stop? And I think part of it is because we're so afraid of entering in the messiness, into the inconvenience of things. And part of it, we have to do some internal work. How does this work? You may not be able to do it, so you need a hand. You need to put yourself under the spiritual authority of someone that is there. I love pastors. I love teaching them cross-cultural skills. But one of the things that I've learned is you cannot have a cross-cultural church unless you live a cross-cultural life. I love these pastors that we're going to do cross-cultural ministry. We love everybody. We're going to save the city. But if you're not entering into the messiness, if you don't do life together with people that you have a tendency to overlook, you can't lead. You cannot lead. Even if you find a way of drawing them to your ministries, that does not mean you're having a transformational moment, a Jesus moment with communities. So I think part of it is really a self-realization. What are the things that I am overlooking in my community, and who are the people that I need to submit? One of the things, Abson, again, I keep confessing my sins, but in my own socialization, I come from a world in which, even though my theology is equality, there is this reality in which we've been socialized in a male-dominant way of thinking. It's not that I want, it's not, but my socialization has created a disposition. So what do I have to do? Well, I have to learn to shift that. And if I can't do it alone, I have to choose mentors. I gotta say, one of the most amazing things that I've done is submit myself to the mentorship of Joanne Solis Walker, of Elizabeth Conde Frazier, of women that have invested in me, and I come under the spiritual authority. We have a woman that's the president of the seminary. You're the dean from Haiti. We need to understand, but many people resist entering into those relationships because they've been so socialized. And we got to make a shift. We got to come under spiritual authority and let other people lead us into their parties, because they're having tremendous parties that we don't even know about. But we need to allow ourselves time in the party for it to get messy enough to realize, wait a second, I'm more messed up. The one that's messed up here, it's me. I better stay in this party, because maybe at any given moment, Jesus is going to do what he does best.
Yeah. And what he does best is invite us to this big party at the end, where people of all nations, tribes, and language are celebrating, right? John looks and said, what's happening? These are the people coming out of the Great Tribulation, and they're waving palm branches and they're celebrating, because salvation belongs to our God. Amen. Thank you. Muchas gracias. Thank you. This was a great conversation. We could continue for another hour. But we need to be hospitable to the people who have agreed to come and be with us. And thank you for those of you who have been here. Muchas gracias todos. One final word, Luigi, before we turn over to Joel Hunt, our host.
Let me just say in Spanish, para aquellos que esperaban una conversación en español, lo sentimos mucho, pero si quieren nos vemos.
Lo sentimos también.
Nos vemos en una fiesta. I was just saying that for those who had expectations that this was in Spanish, we're really sorry, but we'll see you in the party. And for everyone else, I just think that we have a tremendous opportunity in the time we live in, to be the community that parties, that has the messy parties and gets comfortable there. So my invitation is that, and the best theology happens in these parties, more so than in many classrooms. So my invitation is enjoy the heritage that is found in this messy parties that Jesus is still doing.
Amen. Joel?
Amen. Amen. What a fascinating conversation. Like you said, we could go on for hours. And I think the audience would be thrilled with that. I've never had so many comments in the chat, and just fantastic. Thank you both. Dr. Joseph, Dr. Peñaranda, thank you for your time. I can't thank you enough. Thank you for those of you who are watching now, those who will be watching the recording of this event. We will post this on our YouTube channel and our Facebook tomorrow. So please feel free to share that with anyone who you feel would be interested in this conversation. Incredible conversation. Thank you for your time. If you are interested, you're thinking about seminary, we would love to talk to you about that. As you heard from the conversation today, we are blessed with some incredible faculty. Our dean is amazing. Our president, just from the top to bottom, we are just really blessed here. And we would love to chat with you. If God's putting that on your heart, you're interested in seminary, just give us a call, 877-673-0009, or email us at wesley@endwest.edu. We have classes starting in October. If you're ready to get started that soon, we'd love to help you and answer any questions that you have. So thanks again for watching. We appreciate your time. Have a great rest of your day. And remember, we are Wesley and you belong
here.
Absolutely. Somos Wesley. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Blessings.